Hello lovelies. Given Brexit's all up in the air again, and I'm sure people are thoroughly tired of it after my posts about the march and so on, I thought it might be useful to kind of zoom out and take a look at British politics as a whole, and to give a very simple and accessible explanation of how British politics works, because I think some people who are abroad are having some issues understanding how it works and drawing invalid comparisons and parallels to their own political systems. So the first thing you have to understand is that British politics isn't really British politics, it's English politics. England essentially conquered and absorbed Ireland in the past, now limited to Northern Ireland, Wales and Scotland. So these all play subordinate roles to England, and because of this historical inequality, it's England that dominates the culture, it's England that dominates the politics, it's England that dominates the economy. England, and most especially London, is what drives all of Britain, culturally, economically, scientifically, all the rest of it. You know, there are obviously individual exceptions, and I'm speaking very broadly, and I'm not saying that this is necessarily a good thing. It is just the state of affairs that exists. This has been reversed slightly in recent years with regional assemblies. The other side to this, of course, is that England doesn't particularly have its own identity. The English see themselves as British, generally speaking, whereas the Scots see themselves primarily as Scots. The Welsh see themselves primarily as Welsh. Northern Ireland, things are a bit different, but this is one really important thing you need to understand. And of course, England is the only area that doesn't have a regional parliament. To anyone with an even passing interest in politics, certain terminology should be reasonably well known. You'll understand, hopefully, what I would say if I referred to the legislature. You would understand what I was saying if I referred to the executive, and you'd understand what I was saying if I referred to the judiciary. In a country like America, this is pretty set sort of stuff. In the UK, a bit less so. So the judiciary is the judges. That's the same pretty much everywhere. The executive is the Prime Minister and her cabinet. Technically, it would also include the Queen, but we're a constitutional monarchy, which means that the executive acts for the Crown. Not actually for the Crown, but with the power of the Crown. So that the authority of the executive technically derives from the sovereign, but the sovereign has no real power. In theory, they could interfere in some ways, they could deny to sign bills and so on, but this would only precipitate an extremely brief constitutional crisis before Parliament and the executive took control again. Now, the legislature is made up of two bodies: Parliament, which includes the executive, and the House of Lords, which is essentially a retirement home for old politicians where they can go and sleep. That's not particularly democratic, but we kind of let that slide, because while they can introduce amendments and they can refuse new laws and bills and so on put forth by the executive and Parliament, they can only do this to a certain extent, and they can be overridden by Parliament. So really the only power they have is to be bothersome and to slow things down, which is essentially the role of old people everywhere. So the executive proposes bills, the legislature amends and approves bills, and the judiciary interprets and applies bills. And all of this is done in the name of the Crown, but the Crown doesn't actually have any power. Parliament is sovereign. This means that Parliament is what gets the final word on everything in our politics. It is Parliament that must approve of any changes, any differences. Without the approval of Parliament, you're not typically able to do much of anything. save in cases of national emergency, wartime and so on, and still even technically not then. Our politics is very adversarial. It's very much a two-party system, unfortunately, because this discourages things like compromise or deal-making or understanding. It has been a very unusual period recently in that governments have been forced into coalition. This doesn't happen very often under our system because it just doesn't reward you to do so, and most of the time it isn't necessary. Our members of parliament are elected on the first-past-the-post system. So that means whichever party gets the most votes within a seat, which is a certain geographical and population area, they then send a representative, supposedly of that area, to parliament. Whichever party gains the greatest majority of MPs then forms the government. Their leader becomes the Prime Minister. Their Prime Minister selects the executive, the cabinet from amongst the number. In theory, you can also bring anyone into the cabinet at all from the legislature, including the Lords. In practice, this doesn't generally happen a great deal. Generally, it's drawn from Parliament and entirely from that party. In coalitions, sometimes they come to a deal or an arrangement that the new post of the Deputy Prime Minister or a few junior ministerial posts might go to someone from whatever party they formed a coalition with. That's what happened under the Liberal Democrats. Now, first past the post really isn't fit for purpose in a modern democracy. How many people do you know that vote for a politician on a personal basis because they will represent their area particularly? And how many people do you know who vote based entirely on party? How many of them even know who these candidates are? For God's sake, most people vote on the basis of party. That's not how our system is supposed to work. And the argument for retaining first past the post is that there's supposed to be this strong link between your MP and your local constituency so that they can represent your local issues on a national basis. That's not how it works at all. Party completely overrides that, except in the rarest of instances, especially if your MP ends up in any particular position of power as part of the executive or a junior minister or whatever else it might be. They're generally pretty much always going to go with party. So the argument for first past the post falls down, but it does create a very distorted, unrepresentative, and just terrible system, all things considered. And take a very simplified model. Okay, let's say there are only 3 seats. Each one has 100 people in it. Under first past the post, if in one seat 51% of people, so 51 people vote for the blue party, in the next seat 51 people vote for the blue party as well, so you've got 49 and 49 voting for the red party, but then in the third seat everybody votes for the red party. Doesn't matter, the blue party would win both 2 out of the 3 seats and would then form the government. Yeah, that's an extreme example, but that is kind of how it works in practice. We very often end up with governments who most people don't approve of. They just happen to have won more seats. Again, the argument is that there's this link between them and their local constituency. In practice, it doesn't exist. It's all tribalistic politics. It's all party. When it comes to the UK Constitution, it's understandable why you might be a little bit confused. Because on the one hand, we don't have a constitution. We don't have a single set out constitution or Bill of Rights or anything like that. On the other hand, we do have a constitution, but it's spread out over thousands of different documents, legal precedent, tradition, nod, wink, mutual agreement, handshake deals, and all the rest of it. It's immensely confusing and is not gathered in one single place for anyone to reference. So it's almost impossible to understand how things are supposed to work or what rights you have overall, because it's just not gathered in any one single place. It's all over the shop. Yeah, this is why and how so many people have been confused by the actions of the Speaker in Parliament, Berkrow, and his interpretations. Because essentially, when it comes to parliamentary procedure, that is down to him. And a lot of this has been breaking down because people are disagreeing, or they're not going along with tradition, or they're not carrying on with the kind of handshake understandings that have made up the British Constitution up until this point. When something drastic like Brexit happens, it just shows all these fractures and problems and issues with the UK's constitution, and I think creates a very strong case for creating a singular central document. And part of what led me to create this video today is that the Greens are now pushing for a sort of constitutional convention for the UK, no matter what happens with Brexit. And I think that could be something that could happen. I think there might be interest in that from all sides of politics, but we need to get out of this mess first. Now, Brexit has thrown a lot of these problems with British politics into sharp relief. The disconnect between seat representation and party, the inadequacy of first past the post, the deadlock that occurs when you're used to adversarial politics, the increasingly presidential nature of the executive, something that goes back to the 70s but really came on in leaps and bounds under Thatcher and under Blair, and now May is taking it to an almost dictatorial degree and only kind of just barely being hemmed in largely by the judiciary rather than anybody else. Parliament is supposed to be sovereign. This is apparently something that many Brexiters voted for, but every time Parliament asserts its sovereignty, irrational cries of traitor and so on go up, so it's hard to tell what's going on there. The weakness of the union of England with Scotland in particular, but Wales and Northern Ireland as well, has been thrown into sharp relief. England is dragging everyone else with it, and doing something ruinously stupid, Brexit. You know, some people don't seem to understand why Scotland would want to be independent from England, independent from Great Britain, but then want to be part of the EU. Well, a flippant answer is because England does stupid things like want to leave the EU. I think Scotland recognises that there are advantages to being part of a larger whole, particularly when it comes to trade and so on, and as a smaller independent nation, that's something they would very much need to be a part of. I think they recognise that that has value, but also on the other end, being able to make localised decisions also has value. I mean, the EU doesn't dictate to anybody, it's a democracy, it's something you take part in, and you still make the overwhelming majority of your decisions locally, so that there isn't any kind of disjunct there that really exists. So we've got problems in the executive as being overly boisterous, overly power grabby, overly presidential. We've got problems in that fractures have widened and deepened when it comes to Northern Ireland, Scotland, Wales. There's the problem with the first past the post system. Not having a centralised constitution that someone can read and understand is a big issue. It kind of hides that from the citizenry in the way the church used to hide the Bible from the citizenry. It's hard to know what your rights are when they're scattered across hundreds of ancient documents squirreled away in libraries and in the Palace of Westminster and so on. It's broken. First past the post is broken. It's not representative. It's an artifact of a bygone age. We need to move to something that is more representative. Proportional representation would be ideal. We need to move to a more cooperative form of politics rather than adversarial politics. We need to respect our regions more. Yeah, there's all these issues, and so I think there is an impetus, no matter what happens with Brexit, to make this kind of change, to have a constitution. And that would also be an opportunity for people like me, like much of my viewership, to push for rights like free expression and so on, which are being abrogated much more by our own government than by Europe, which has many more safeguards on those kind of rights and against exploitation by corporations and against the trampling of our rights by our own governments. So I think this idea, even though it's only really being put forward by the Greens at the moment, is something we should throw our weight behind. Something I think many people across political lines, across the culture war divide and so on, could agree on in the UK, that it would be great if we had clearly set out rights and obligations and processes. Zang.
Where the trains ran on time, where all the water
The police bring in reinforcements.
there was justice there, no poverty, and no violent crime. The children never cry.